when people were dying and everyone said to me, you have to mourn, go to the funeral, go to the memorial, whatever, I went, no, I don't want to mourn. I want to remember. I want to stay angry. I want to be able to talk about this after it's over. I will mourn when we've broken through something. And I didn't mourn, and I didn't let myself feel those feelings because I had to stay angry, to stay active and stay strong.
Today on Rainbow Country, award-winning playwright Brad Fraser joins me to talk about his memoir, All the Rage, a partial memoir in 2 acts and a prologue.
Hi there, I'm Bennett Singer, a documentary filmmaker and the co-director of the new film Cured, which is currently available on PBS and on the PBS video app. You are listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
Brad Fraser, hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am well. First of all, I always say this to my guests, but thank you for being here to have your voice, your story be heard by the LGBT community and beyond. So thank you so much for that. So Brad, let's talk about you, shall we?
Sure.
So Brad, it's hard, it's big, it's thick. Of course, I'm talking about your memoir.
Uh-huh.
Your memoir, Brad.
Mm-hmm.
Get your mind out of the gutter.
Okay.
All the Rage, a partial memoir in 2 acts and a prologue. Let's jump right in. Let's just jump right in. So the book is split into 4 segments: prologue, act 1, act 2, epilogue. In a nutshell, what are you talking about in each of these segments?
Well, in the prologue, I talk about my childhood and growing up and how difficult that was. And in part 1, it starts when I finally get out of academic high school and enter school for the performing arts. And my life changes quite drastically then. And the first part follows me right up until I write Unidentified Human Remains and the True Nature of Love, and it premieres in Calgary. Part 2 is everything after that: the success of Remains, Poor Superman, the writing of other plays, the kind of worst of the AIDS epidemic. And then the epilogue is kind of my wrap up and my cri de coeur, or my stating of my mandate of what it is to be queer and how I won't be silenced.
So in your memoir, you talk about your plays. You talk about Wolf Boy, Unidentified Human Remains and the True Nature of Love, Poor Superman. You just mentioned the beginning of the book, you talk about being born to teenage parents. You also talk about your upbringing instilling a tremendous anger within you. What was it about your childhood that made you so angry? Talk to me about what happened.
Well, I was raised by angry people, by a lot of angry people, not just my parents, but both sides of the family. They all had certain problems with anger. Certainly on my father's side, they're all cowboys. It's a very punch anybody out who doesn't agree with you kind of world. And my mother's family was the exact opposite. They were very cold, withholding people, and they didn't want to have much to do with children. My parents themselves were angry.
They were children.
Sorry, I've got a cat here. Hold on.
Yeah. What's your cat's name?
Weird today. I think it's the heat. Maggie.
Hi, Maggie. But your parents were children themselves when they had you.
Well, they weren't to me.
Mm-hmm.
They were my parents. They were adults. I mean, my mother was barely 16 when I was born. My father was 18. And, it's easy to look back and say, oh, yes, they were children. But there were lots of people who had children at a young age at that time. It wasn't unusual for women to be married and have children before they were 18 years old, in the class I come from anyway, at that time. So, one cuts them a certain amount of slack for being young, but I don't cut them a lot of slack for being lazy or self-absorbed or less interested in their children than they might have been.
Mm. Are you still an angry man?
I look at the inequities that are going on in our nation, in the world, and that makes me angry. I look at the fact that People are making increasingly less money and being asked to do more, and that's as true of artists as it is of anyone else. With less compensation, and I look at the way money is being funneled up to the top 10% at the cost of everyone else, and that makes me really angry.
When it comes to your childhood, are you still angry?
Well, it was interesting, I had thought I had reconciled most of that stuff, and I have spoken of it publicly before. I was on the cover of Saturday Night Magazine in 1993, and I talked about these issues as well, and I've given other interviews and things about them. And I thought I had quite a handle on it, but the thing about going back and having to relive your life again, and it's not just my childhood, but throughout, is one becomes much more aware of how badly they were treated in retrospect sometimes than when it was happening. And that made me angry. And, as far as my childhood goes, my mother and I have made peace. I mean, she has worked very hard to reconcile the person she was with the person she is now, and to try to deal with maybe some of the damage she did to her children and that kind of thing. So I don't hold a lot of anger there. But my father's reaction has been basically the same as it would have been when I was a kid. It's abusive, it's angry, it belittles me, and I just don't put up with that kind of thing anymore. And I'm quite clear when I hear from those particular people, I'm quite clear that their opinion doesn't mean anything to me. So I suppose, yes, in having to go in there, it did reopen some old wounds and that kind of thing, but it also spurred some conversations with people within my family that have actually advanced things forward. So it's been kind of a mixed blessing, but I'm not nearly as angry now as I was when I was young.
So All the Rage, a partial memoir in 2 acts and a prologue. That's quite the title. Is there a story behind this particular title?
Well, it sounded theatrical. I mean, when I wrote the book, I wanted to structure it the way I would structure a play, with a first act and a second act. And then when the publishers insisted that I had to write about my childhood, that became the prologue. And the epilogue, Shakespearean plays often had prologues and epilogues and that kind of thing. And so I felt like I was just playing around with the conventions of the venue and the industry that I've been most involved in my life.
Are you looking to take this on the road? Are you looking to do a one-man show to talk about your experiences, your life?
No, I'm not. I really wish there was a book tour, because I don't mind reading for a few minutes or whatever. But, I did the audio version of the book. I read it myself, and it was one of the most excruciating things I've ever done in terms of being locked in a little studio with someone on a headphone directing you and that kind of thing. And it really inspired a new kind of respect from me for the people who are performers that I know, and how hard they work and how difficult it can be. So no, with this one, I'm not really looking to take it on the road. If I wanted to do that, I am a highly regarded playwright. I probably would have written it as a play. But for me, the challenge of finally writing a book, which is something I've wanted to do all of my life, was really a wonderful opportunity. And I like to let a book be a book and not a show, although that doesn't preclude other things. I mean, I'm working on a new project right now, which is about my relationship with my 85-year-old neighbor, who I've known for about 7 years, who has dementia. And she's a lesbian, and she doesn't have any children. She doesn't have any family, and most of her friends are dead. And so I've been caring for her, and while he was alive, her dog as well. And I think once I get that written in whatever form it's going to take, that's something I might be interested in taking on as a one-man show or something, but not my biography. For another thing, I don't think I would be able to tell those stories, some of those stories, without breaking down. And I always feel that's very unprofessional, but it's still very emotional material for me to talk about my childhood, or to talk about the many people I loved who were lost to AIDS. And I don't know if I could do that. That being said, I probably wouldn't object if an actor wanted to do that.
What inspired this book? What made you write this book?
Well, I've been approached a number of times about writing a memoir or an autobiography, and I always said, no, I'm too young. The story's not over. I don't want to, look back into my past that deeply. And every year on Facebook and Twitter on World AIDS Day, I have a file of pictures of people who died of AIDS, famous and not famous, people that I knew or admired. And there are literally hundreds of them. And I spend the whole day posting them on social media to remind people of what was lost. And one day, Bruce Walsh, who was at that time the publisher at the University of Regina Press, contacted me and said, these are great stories. You have such a feeling for it. Why don't you write your memoir as a partial AIDS memoir and make it about the people that were lost as much as about yourself? And when that was proposed to me, I went, yeah, you know what? That makes sense. I could write that book because that book isn't just about me. It's also about the people I knew and loved. So that made it a lot easier. Now, as things happen, Bruce ended up leaving the University of Regina and someone else came in, and I've been in situations where a new regime takes over from an old regime and it doesn't work out well for the artists who were involved with the old regime usually. So I asked to be released from that contract and took the book elsewhere.
So you have your new memoir, All the Rage, but you also have old movies for young people on YouTube.
Yes.
What is Old Movies for Young People?
Old Movies for Young People comes from when I did my master's at the University of Toronto 7 years ago. I met a young man in the class. I was the oldest and probably the gayest person in the program, and he was the youngest and probably the straightest person in the program. And we got along like a house on fire and became very close friends. And I started showing him movies from the 20th century that were important to me, that often had a queer component in them. To see how he would respond to them, being, as he's that generation that grew up mostly in this century. And after we'd watched a couple hundred movies, we both went, we should do something with this. So we decided to start a show called Old Movies for Young People, where I show him a movie that meant something to me in the 20th century, and we discuss it in terms of what it meant then, but also how people might react to it now, and what holds up and what doesn't, and what is offensive and what isn't, and how is queerdom depicted at that time compared to how it is now. And we do sort of sometimes we do one movie for under 10 minutes, but this season we've started doing two movies, what we call a double feature throwdown, where we put up two movies that we probably are going to have opposing opinions on and decide which one is better.
Sort of like a throwback to Siskel and Ebert.
Yeah, exactly. If one of them was queer and one of them was young and straight, very much that kind of thing. Although we tend to go into more depth and examine it a lot more thoroughly than they did. We're not just reviewing movies, we're actually deconstructing them and talking about how they work in this new century with all of these new rules going on, some of which are extremely valid, some of which just make me go, what are you talking about?
So do you care to elaborate on that? When you say these new rules in regards to movie making, which ones make you go, what are you talking about?
Well, there are... we have to acknowledge that we come from a racist and homophobic and misogynist system and society, and that those things are reinforced all the time. And there are a lot of movies from the 20th century that really wallow in racism, misogyny, and homophobia, and yet some of them are actually very good movies. So how do we reconcile that as queer people or as concerned people? How much of it do we take seriously, and how much of it do we say, well, that was a product of the time and we just have to live with it? And what I find really interesting is when we're talking about old movies or old books or historical artwork or whatever, there's a lot of emphasis on race and on misogyny, but there isn't quite the same rigorous agitating of homophobia in those mediums, whether it's through exclusion, where we just don't exist, or whether it's through the way that we're often depicted as villains or as weaklings or as the person who's going to betray the system. So for me, the struggle is always, how much am I willing to put up with to get sort of to the kernel of the movie or the play, and at what point do I want to go, okay, this is crap, I just have to walk away from this because it's absolutely terrible. And we can't lump them all in together, because if you want to start canceling everything that was racist and everything that was misogynistic, then let's take that to the next step and let's cancel everything that was homophobic. And to be frank with you, almost everything up until the turn of the century was homophobic in some way. So where do we draw that line is the question I ask myself.
Do you want to give a couple examples of movies that you're talking about?
Of movies that we're talking about, oh my God, we've done so many. I have to think here. Well, one of the movies that we haven't actually, okay, movies we talked about, we didn't talk about that one. One of the movies we haven't spoken about is Cruisin' from 1980, I believe, which was the Al Pacino journey into the dark underworld of gay male sexuality, which when you watch it is like, nothing sexual ever happened on a set this brightly lit, for one thing. And for another thing, the outcry at the time was that this was about murder, that the gay people were being murdered, and the gay person was probably a murderer, and it wasn't showing the other side of the way gay people live. And in fact, very few people live in that dark leather underworld, and even then, few people lived in it as well. But my response to that is always, yeah, but we're not making movies or telling stories in order to necessarily bolster a particular segment of society, but we're actually making movies to entertain people, to scare people, to frighten them, to be provocative. And so when I look at that movie and the outcry now, I go, yeah, I historically understand why we were mad about that, but as far as the movie goes, I don't think that many people saw it because it's not a particularly good movie, and it's one that is rather troubling in the way it depicts part of the community, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it. In fact, I think it's a great jumping off point to start talking about the depiction of queers in the media.
Do you consider yourself a cinephile?
No, that word has too many academic pretensions to it. I consider myself a movie lover. Okay. I consider myself someone who works in movies, who is working to understand movies, but I also like to look at the larger effect movies have on our society and what attitudes they've been guilty of maintaining and what attitudes they haven't shown, what stories they haven't told. And, it was the same thing in the theater. When I started in the theater, I started writing plays for people who didn't go to the theater, people we didn't see on the stage. And I'm not just talking about queer people, I'm also talking about poor people. I'm talking about people like me who grew up in poverty. I'm talking about people from the lower classes who aren't necessarily encouraged to come to the theater. And certainly when they are, most representation they will see will be at best patronizing if they're talked about at all. So, I think it's interesting for all of us to know what kind of effect the TV shows we watch, the movies we watch, the books we read, comic books, any of that kind of thing. What are the prevailing attitudes that are being perpetuated within these mediums, and how do we as queer artists address that, respond to it, or fight against it? And you don't necessarily have to do all three in every case.
So when it comes to old movies for young people, how long have you been doing this now?
We've done 2 seasons. The first season, we did 10 episodes, and we had no idea what we were doing. We were shooting with our phones. We had some basic technical equipment, and it looks terrible. But we had filmed it all. We were going to follow through on it, so I spent months and months editing it and trying to make it look as good as I could. And we put that out there, and we got a fairly good response. So this season, we'd actually rented a studio. It was last summer we were going to do it when we had that brief period where we weren't in lockdown. And we had rented a studio and we couldn't go to the studio. So we ended up doing it in my apartment again. But at this time, we got a technical consultant. We got some lights. We got some proper equipment. And it looks much better. And we did 12 episodes this season, and half of them are double feature throwdowns. So we're talking about a lot of movies. And the finale for the season, which I'm just cutting right now, we are going to compare every version of A Star is Born plus What Price Hollywood, which was the 1932 movie that kind of started the whole thing rolling. So we were much more ambitious this year.
Wow.
And much better prepared for what we were going to do. We had no idea the first season.
And this is on YouTube.
It's on YouTube. Yes, it's on all platforms, but you can find it most easily on YouTube under Old Movies for Young People or through my Twitter feed or Facebook page.
Okay. Disappearing the queer. I will not be disappeared. Talk to me about the end of your memoir, All the Rage, and what you're getting at when you say, I will not be disappeared. What are you getting at?
Well, disappearing the queer is something I've been very aware of all my life. And I think I became most aware of it during the AIDS years when men I knew would die, and all their gay friends would descend on their apartment and get rid of all the gay porn and pictures of ex-boyfriends and sex toys and any kind of signifier of being queer, so the family wouldn't be embarrassed by it. And that was the first time it occurred to me that not only do they try to keep us invisible while we're alive, but they also try to keep us invisible while we're dead. And so then I started looking further into that, particularly when I was doing my master's. And what does it mean to disappear the queer, and how do we do it? Queer people do it to one another when we put things like, no fats, no femmes, no Asians, and all those horribly offensive kind of riders that we seem to think are okay to attach to our desires, that we actually do it too. And I really feel it that although my work hasn't changed in any way, except that it's improved a great deal, as I've gotten older, it's gotten much harder for me to be produced, it's gotten much harder for me to be heard, and it's gotten much harder for me to get the same kind of coverage I once had. For example, with this book, the Globe and Mail has not done a preview. As far as I know, they're not planning to do a review. They didn't review my last play when it was in Edmonton or in Ottawa. And I feel like because I am one of those queers who've spoken out against homophobia in the media for the last 40 years, that in fact, and if you go through the book, I chronicle their reaction to my work, which in almost every case is homophobic and condemns it as well, in some way, as not being good enough or not being interesting or whatever. And I really feel that that's the perfect example of what happens to us, that, when you're kind of the young, exciting queer guy who's making a fuss and carrying on and making headlines, they can't leave you alone. But as soon as you sort of age out of that and you want to do more dignified work or you want to have a deeper discussion, they're not interested in that. They don't want to be they don't want to be singled out for their own homophobia historically. And for me, that's a very big part of disappearing the queer. And Canadians are great at it. Canadians love to ignore anything they don't want to talk about or justify. It's just like it doesn't exist. We're just not going to acknowledge it. And I feel that happens with a lot of queer people in a lot of different settings.
Wow.
And it's not going to happen to me. If I have to kick down every door in this fucking country, it's not going to happen to me. I'll tell you that.
So how are you getting around that? Like you were just saying it in regards to the Globe and Mail not covering you.
Well, I do what I can. I mean, I've written them letters. I've sent them messages. I've talked to their reviewers. I've done what I can. I say something like this on this radio show. I write something about it in a column. I make it clear that I'm not going to be pushed aside. There's another anecdote in the book about how when I won the Alberta Culture Playwriting Competition in the adult category when I was 19, one of the prizes was you were supposed to get a production with this new theater in town. Well, the director of the new theater came to Banff with me to work on the play, which had it didn't even have a queer character. It actually had a straight boy who hustles to make money to save his sick father. And after the workshop, the director came up to me and said, we're not going to do your play. We're going to do the second place play because it seems like something our audience would be more interested in. Which in 1979 is a really hard thing to counter. I mean, what are you supposed to do when you're 19 years old and this grown-up is telling you you're not getting the prize that was announced you would receive when you won the award because of something gay in it? And I didn't know how to respond to that. So a big part of my adult life has been ensuring that doesn't happen again. That I do speak out, that I do say something. And if the person saying it or doing the act won't listen to me, then I will speak to other people on a larger platform and see what happens then.
So in your book, in your memoir, All the Rage, you have photos sprinkled throughout. And when you were sourcing out those images, I'm sure emotions came up for you. And you were talking about this earlier, but was creating this book, writing this book, sourcing out those images, was this process cathartic for you?
It was very cathartic, and I cried a lot when I was writing this book, just because, I hadn't a lot. When people were dying and everyone said to me, you have to mourn, go to the funeral, go to the memorial, whatever, I went, no, I don't want to mourn. I want to remember. I want to stay angry. I want to be able to talk about this after it's over. I will mourn when we've broken through something. And I didn't mourn, and I didn't let myself feel those feelings because I had to stay angry, to stay active and stay strong. So when I sat down to write the book, I knew I was going to be opening a can of emotional worms, and it certainly was. I mean, to go back and relive those things, and I have a very strong sensory memory. Like when I remember something, I just don't remember what was said. I remember what I was wearing. I remember what the other person looked like. I remember the smells in the room. I remember the contextual songs that were going on at the time. So it was actually quite frightening about how, when I found out how deeply and profoundly I could remember things. And I actually had to start sort of blocking off doors in my memory just to keep focused on what I was doing. So it was cathartic, and it was very emotional. It was very emotional. When I wrote those final words of the first draft, and the first book, the first version of this book was much longer, almost twice as long as the book you're looking at now. I put everything in it that I could remember that I thought would be of note, and then started sculpting the actual finished project out of that. So there are a lot of subsidiary memories and other things that happened that don't make it anywhere near the book that also had profound effects on me.
Was the process healing for you at all?
Healing. Yes, it was. I mean, I've always used my art to heal myself. I've always used creativity to deal with my psychic trauma and that kind of thing, emotional trauma and stuff like that. So it was healing. And I think that anytime any artist creates something, there is some kind of healing factor involved in what they're doing and why they're doing it. But I really hope that other people who lived through what I lived through also can look back at it, because there are so few of us who survived from my community and my generation, and they will also find something cathartic and healing in it. And I also hope that people who weren't there will read it and now understand why we are the way we are. Why, when you meet a gay man in his 50s or 60s, they are hard people. They are not people who tend to back down. They're people who tend to speak out. And that's because we lived through a war. We saw, the same proportion of people we love die as happened in the Vietnam War or World War II. People get offended when you say things like that. I remember at Martin yesterday when it was done at Buddy's, and I had footage of the death camps from World War II playing in the background when Martin had a monologue about having to kill one of his friends in the hospital because he was so sick and he couldn't die, and they were just trying to preserve his life, and how people were offended by that. And I think, how can you be offended by that? Gay men were not only put into the camps, but when the camps were liberated, they weren't let go. They were put into mental institutions and prisoners, and their imprisonment and torture continued for decades after that. So that kind of one-sided, how dare queer people compare their experience to what we went through, really offends me. And I think really needs to be talked about.
Mm. Another component of your memoir, and you were talking about this earlier, is the audiobook. Personally, I love an audiobook. You were mentioning that it was horrific for you. You hated it, but you read it.
I did.
And how long did that process take?
It took 6 hour sessions, and then just one catch-up session, about half an hour to repair things and fix things that weren't happening. Yeah, now, I had actor training, and I acted for a number of years, and I can do these things, but I chose not to be a performer after being a performer for a reason. So I don't love audiobooks. I like to read, and I like to read very quickly, and I like my brain to create the voices and things that happen. When I write a play or a movie or a TV show, I'm writing things that are meant to be performed, that are meant to be said aloud. But when I was writing this book, the challenge was it was completely different. I wasn't just writing the tip of the iceberg, I was writing the entire iceberg. And so I could go into people's heads and I could editorialize and I could do all of those things that I can't do when I'm a dramatist. So that was very interesting to me. But then you do those things and you write those very intimate moments and things like that. And I never for a moment thought I would have to read them aloud in the presence of other people. So things that I write when I'm by myself, that people read when they're by themselves, have a much different impact, particularly when one is talking about their sex life or their drug use, than they do when you have to say those things aloud,
Mm. This will come as no surprise to you, but you are an outspoken individual. And when it comes to social media, that's a platform for people to, express themselves.
I have been from the time I was 13 years old and I stood up to my abusive father and said, you can't do this to me anymore. Mm. I have always been the guy who says the things other people think but won't say. That is my role. In any group that I've been in, that's who I have had to become, because most people are very reticent about expressing an honest opinion, particularly if it's negative or critical in some way. And so I went, okay, well, I'm never going to get anywhere by doing what everyone else is doing. So let's do what everyone else isn't doing. And let's say those things that aren't being said. Let's speak out when something wrong is going on. Let's be the guy, and I'm very lucky because I'm a very tall, white-appearing man, and I've gotten bigger as I've aged, so I become more intimidating to people. So I'm granted a certain level of privilege within our society just by who I am and how I look. And so if I have that privilege, why not use it in a constructive manner? Why not use it to do and say the things other people may not have the strength or the courage or the ability to say? Facebook, I can have sort of long conversations with people and write essays and get into depth and stuff. I follow politics a lot. I don't subscribe to the popular hegemony. I'm not afraid to have an alternate opinion. And I like being able to call out politicians and so-called leaders in our society publicly. It's a great freedom. I mean, for years and years, all we could do was write letters to the newspaper that upheld all those attitudes anyway, which they may or may not print. But on social media, we have a platform where we can say what we want, and those who want to hear us can join us and agree or disagree. And I think that's a very powerful tool, as Donald Trump has proven.
So, Brad, when people read or when they listen to All the Rage, what would you like your audiences to come away with after consuming your memoir?
Well, what people take away from any work of art is completely individual and completely up to them and highly subjective and all of that. But I would hope people reading my book, particularly people who don't feel they have any power, who come from a background where they fear they might never be able to escape it, who feel like they're being held in place by things beyond their control, that my story will serve as an example of someone who broke through those walls, who broke down those barriers, who did everything they could against great adversity sometimes in order to be heard and have the same opportunities as everyone else, and to understand that it's never all good. It's never all happy. It's never all sad. Our lives are a mixture of challenges and triumphs, and usually more failures than successes. But the important thing is that we all keep moving ahead and not get discouraged, and realize that often it takes more than one attempt to make something happen. Sometimes we have to do it again and again for a very long time before it finally breaks through, and not to give up hope, because the real power comes not from what you achieve, but from what you're struggling to do, and how hard that struggle is, and how willing you are to fight for what you want, which in the end, I think is the most important thing of all.
Brad Fraser, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for being on the show. Well said, well done,
Pleasure.
well written.
Thanks very much.